Hi, I'm Callie from CRK Training, and today we have an interview with two equine nutritionists. So I'm here with Robert Proto from Stoltz Food Feed and Supply, which is a local shop to our area here in Pennsylvania. And we're also here with Bob Rich, who works for Buckeye Nutrition. So I actually had put out a question for you guys on my Facebook and my Twitter accounts or pages, and I just asked you guys, what questions do you want me to ask when I meet with Robert and Bob? What questions do you have as far as horse feeding? So I kind of put together the main ones that everyone was asking, and that's what I'm gonna ask these guys to answer for us here today. So one of the big things I think that people were thinking about when they were asking these questions is, of course, feeding grain. First thing are what are the best sources of protein, sources of fat when you're looking at concentrated feeds?
Sure. Well, thanks for having us, Callie. I'm going to defer that first question over to Bob, and then I'm going to follow up with it because his particular feed is very effective, and as being located in Ohio, it's very close to major sources of the grains and some of the ingredients they use. So he can address that a little bit more directly, and then I'll talk about how effectively I use it in my role with nutrition.
Perfect.
Well, by far the most popular and probably the best for horses source of protein is obviously soybean meal. Mm-hmm. Number one, it's very available, it's very digestible, and it's economically feasible. It also is a great source of lysine and some of the other things that we need to provide in the diet. Other sources that are becoming more popular and we tend to use more and more of for various reasons would include flaxseed meal, mm-hmm. because these are also sources not only of protein but also of omega-3 and 6 fatty acids and very different balances of amino acids. So we're using more of a blend of proteins to meet all the requirements in the horse's diet. Mm-hmm. Regarding fat, we've used vegetable oils and corn oils for years and years and years. But once again, we're going back to soybean oil as a more common fat source. Flaxseed is often used in fat supplements, mm-hmm. because they're very digestible and they suit the nutrient profile of a horse's requirements. Mm-hmm. So as I look at fat supplements, I always tend to look for ones that are more a blend of good fat sources rather than a single source, such as the corn oil. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think a good thing to bring up at this point from both of our positions, and certainly for you and the viewers, is the key word to think about when talking about all those ingredients and the sources of amino acids or branched chain amino acids is the balance that you achieve. Mm-hmm. And when you get a feed product like Buckeye, for example, whatever components of their product line you see, they usually work really hard to balance those different ingredients to make sure that you have the right balance of amino acids in order to get an effective type of protein. Absolutely. And the blend of fats, your omega-6s and 3s that Bob mentioned, are very important because one of the things he mentioned was corn oil, very high in 6s, so it's very inflammatory. And what you want is the 3-6 balance to be appropriate so that you don't get an exuberant inflammatory response in all of your body systems.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that was, I kind of wanted to start with that question because that was a big one, but that was a little specific. Let's go to a general, maybe someone that hasn't been managing horses quite as long. What are the most important things to think about from just even a safety standpoint of horse feeding nutrition? Feed
more hay.
Okay. Yep.
Even though I work for a grain feed company, I think very often we see people not feeding enough hay to the horse, mm-hmm. and maybe overfeeding grain. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to talk a little further about hay, mm-hmm. but that would be the number one thing from a safety standpoint.
Exactly.
The overall health of the horse.
Yeah.
Is feed plenty of hay and the very best hay you can find.
Yep.
And that's again very, very important there. It's a general rule of thumb is 2% of their total body weight in forage on a daily basis, whether that's hay and or a grass mixture with pasture. And that's just your requirement. You can go above that depending on the quality of your hay. And a lot of people look at it as a filler. It's not necessarily a filler. It's very important for their metabolism that they get an appropriate amount of hay. And it's very important to understand that they also get nutrition from it. And if you feed good quality hay and enough of it, as Bob mentioned, then you can certainly, you'll reap some benefits there. And as a result, you can feed some of the more expensive components like grains or concentrates.
Right. Yeah.
And then you can really achieve an appropriate balance. And as Bob mentioned, to feed more of that, what you do then is, in our role, when we come out to help people and look at their horses and talk to them about it, is we achieve, again, balance. We balance with the ration balances or other different products for what's not in the hay or what is in the hay. And again, the amount you feed and what product you feed of those particular feed lines is what achieves balance and makes the horses perform well.
Yeah. Now, for our viewers, can you define a ration balancer? Is that the same as a concentrator, or is that different?
A ration balancer and concentrate are words that are used interchangeably.
Okay.
It basically is a product that covers all the horse's needs in a small package. Going with the concept of feeding more hay and less grain, this is something that provides all that's lacking in the hay in a very small package rather than feeding 5 or 6 or 8 pounds of grain. Many times we only feed 1 or 2. And this allows the horse to eat more hay and promotes the overall health and avoids problems, many of the problems such as colic and some of these things.
Yeah. So a ration balancer is concentrated form of fortification, I guess you could say.
Okay.
So it is, as he said, it is an interchangeable term. And again, not all concentrates or all ration balancers are created equal. So you have to take a good, just like people are more aware now of reading ingredients in their own food that they consume in the supermarket and wherever, and are very conscious about where their food comes from. The same thing as far as your horse's feed is concerned, especially ration balancers too.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what about grass? Like, obviously here in Pennsylvania, we're in winter, we don't really have much grass, but I know I've heard this discussed a lot among horse people. If you have a pasture with a lot of grass, is your horse fine out there, or should you really be doing something else?
Well, once again, it's all about grass or hay. In the summer we have grass, in the winter we have hay. And using a commercial supplement to balance out what's not in the pasture, which basically, once again, is some of the proteins, amino acids, vitamins and minerals and micronutrients. And that's all we need. We don't need calories. Normally with good pasture, they say plenty fat, but we still lack some of the micronutrients and the things to round out the nutrient profile. And that's, once again, we use small amounts of very concentrated feed because they're getting all the calories they need from the pasture.
And this is a good time to bring up the fact that, again, pasture, if it's available, is great if you can have the opportunity to get your horses on it. But too much of any good thing is dangerous, so you need to be careful about that. And you need to monitor. It's a very dynamic situation. It's a seasonal, as you mentioned. In the wintertime, you don't have pasture. Yeah. And then in the spring, you have a certain type of pasture. It's very lush, and your cool season grasses are growing. Then you have your summertime, and then you go into your late summer, early fall, into late fall. So you have a very, pasture has, its character changes at that point. Another thing to consider when your horses are out on pasture is, what are they doing for a living? Are they idle? Do they have a low amount of work, a moderate amount of work, or a high amount of work? Because again, there are calories as well as nutrition involved in the pasture that you're feeding your horse on. So you need to monitor them. One of the things we do is we go around and we have a portable scale to weigh horses, not only to evaluate body condition, but if a horse is getting too much pasture, I think the next thing we talk about is a grazing muzzle or having a sacrifice field, or regulating the amount of time they get on pasture. We see just as many obese horses that have metabolically been challenged because of their obesity, just like it seems the human population is these days. Too much of a good thing, back to my earlier comment. So knowing what their weight is, knowing what their body condition score is, and being able to regulate their exposure to those pastures is important.
Yeah. So I guess what it comes down to is, every horse is going to be an individual.
Indeed.
As to what he needs.
No question about it.
Yeah. All right, well, let me get back to my list of questions here. Another one that I had from a viewer was, what types of hay are best?
Well, there's grass hays and there's legumes like alfalfa. In my opinion, I prefer to buy the best quality hay I can get, be it grass or alfalfa, or a mix of the two. Yep. Overall quality is very, very important. All things being equal, I tend to lean more towards the grass, just as being a little easier to manage. You can buy a good quality orchard grass, Timothy mix. That's hard to beat, and it causes very few problems and is more than adequate for most horses and most disciplines.
Yeah, the maturity of the hay when it's harvested is very important. A lot of people talk about first cutting, second cutting, third cutting, and in some alfalfas and legumes you actually get a fourth, and in some cases, if you're fortunate, a fifth cutting. And each one of those are, your first cutting obviously is taken in the springtime. As a rule, it's difficult to make hay during that period of time because it's not full summer, so you have some rain coming on, you have limited sunlight. Just like the seasons, you'll know the sun is at a certain position in the sky, so you may have difficulty drying your hay in order to make it, to bring it in. And the lack of that sunshine, or I guess you could say the budgeting of it, is what dictates how much nutrients is generated within the hay before it's laid down to be baled. And it also limits the drying time you have. So that's an important part of what you do. So as a rule, your second cutting grass hays are usually in pretty good shape. Those are usually chock full of nutrients, reasonably well made, and there's again, it's drier, it's June-ish, end of June, July, and stuff like that. So you have an opportunity to bring in good hay, which has a very good relative feed value, and that's something we look for in all of these, whether it's a legume or a grass hay or a grass hay mixture, is the when you get it analyzed, we have a rough idea of what nutrition is in it. And again, back to the ration balancing, that's when we decide how to do that.
Okay.
But overall, buy the greenest, softest hay you can, and you'll probably be just fine.
Right, and in the case of alfalfa, your leaf to stem ratio is very important. You want more leaf than stem. They'll utilize the stem and chew it and use it as a fiber source for sure, but the good stuff's in the leaves.
Yeah.
Good stuff's in the leaves.
Okay.
The coarser it is, the less is in it. So if it hurts your hands, it's probably not going to be real good hay.
Yep. Now, is there such a thing as, like a little bit, we kind of touched on the horses that, they gain weight really easily on grass and stuff. Is there too much of a good thing with high quality hay too?
Absolutely. So sometimes for laminitic horses, ponies, horses that are constantly obese, we look for a medium quality hay. Still very, very sensitive to dust, mold, those types of contaminants. But I would tolerate a little coarser, medium quality hay for them, and it's in their best interest because it will be lower in calories.
In regulating the amount of that hay they take in is important too. So that in that case, we talk about hay nets, slow feed hay nets, any sort of a regulatory process that's going to act like a muzzle on the hay, as opposed to a muzzle on the horse.
Okay.
Being able to regulate the amount of that product that they come in. And we all have horses that wolf down their hay, and you come back and you say, oh, where did it go? So, if you want to make sure that the horses are busy all day long when they're in the stall and have access to hay, you can get devices that you can use that'll make sure that say, for example, 2% of their body weight per day lasts all day long, whatever that is. And again, that regulates the amount they can take in. Keeps them busy as well, trying to take that in.
Yep. Okay. Going back to another question I have here, what is the most common mistakes that you see either horse owners making, or maybe even just kind of mistakes or problems in like the horse feed industry in general?
I go back to my initial comment of not enough hay and too much grain, very honestly.
Yeah.
We need to maximize the forage, and that's best for the overall health of the horse, and helps us avoid many of the common problems that bring the vet to the farm.
I agree with Bob 100%. Another subset of that is to actually know how much you're feeding of whatever, whether it's hay or grain or concentrate in pounds rather than scoops or quarts or something like that. Depending on the type of hay, knowing how much your hay bale weighs is very important because you know what you're getting for your dollar. Most hay commercially is sold by the ton. So, you know, knowing if you've got a 50-pound bale as opposed to a 20-pound bale, and then how much of that bale the horse is eating on a daily basis, again, will help you with the 2% of their body weight ration. But also when you're measuring out your concentrate, your grain, or your ration balance, or knowing what that is in pounds, it helps us as consultants to come in and actually tell you right down to the ounce how much your horse should get for their activity level and what they need to keep the lights on. That sort of thing. Okay. So those are the things. Again, some people use a coffee can, some people use a soda can, some people use a measuring cup from their kitchen. Having a uniform idea of what each product weighs, for example, is very important. Let's draw an example of that. For example, if you have a very dense fortification that's in a pelleted form that has a lot of minerals in it, minerals are rock. So a cup of that will weigh more than, say, for example, maybe a cup of oats, just because of what's inside of that. And so, you know, those two aren't created equal. So if you're going to get different results depending on the amount of each you feed. And that's when you come into the situation where you have a horse that looks fluffy, I guess you could say, or looks heavy or obese, and rather than feed it what it actually needs in a ration balancer form, they give it a handful of a commercial feed product. And if you read your feed tag labels, which I guess would be the third thing that we should talk about, if you read your feed tag labels, there's recommended feeding amounts for the horses and their activity level of that product based on their weight. And if you're giving them a handful of something when in fact on a daily basis it's formulated to be getting 4 to 6 pounds of that, you're feeding them a deficient diet. Very important to know. Very important to know.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I want to try to kind of wrap things up a little of what we talked about, just to kind of put it in maybe some clear actionable things that people can take away, and, you know, correct me if I misunderstood anything. So we want to be looking at feeding a base of forage, you know, feeding a lot of hay, grass, whatever. That should be about 2% of the horse's body weight.
Yes.
And then from there, you know, you have to determine if your horse needs extra nutrition. He might need a ration balancer, or he might need more concentrates if he needs to gain weight. Correct. And in that case, we need to be making sure that, you know, we're reading our feed labels and that we're feeding something that's formulated to do the job that we're trying to do. Am I correct?
That's
absolutely
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to ask questions. You can, you know, reach out to anybody like ourselves or someone else and just say, what do you think you recommend? Veterinarians certainly should be involved in any nutrition decisions you make, but advising them and then describing that to the veterinarian is important, so they have an idea of what you want to do, what you want to achieve. And there may be metabolic reasons that we're unaware of, or even the horse owner's unaware of, that may predispose or preclude a horse from using a certain product. And that's always important to talk about as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's kind of finish up with talking a little bit about you guys, because this was another thing. Actually, when I put the question out there, I had a few people that were like, "Horse nutritionist? What's that?" So I guess tell us a little bit, you know, how you got started in doing this, and kind of what your job is and what you offer as a service.
Well, I've been in the animal nutrition business for quite a number of years, and the last 20 years have been involved almost exclusively with horse feeds. The services we offer is we prefer to come to your barn, actually look at your horses, and then make recommendations considering the hay, the condition of the horses, and give you a complete program. It's very difficult for us to give you accurate information if we don't know a little bit about your horses and what you want to do with them, and are they overweight, underweight. These are all the types of things that go into a feed recommendation. And that's a little bit about the service we provide. In many cases, we even, as Robert says, we weigh the horses and come back on a regular basis and track their progress, either to gain or lose weight, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and you know, as far as why we got into this, I mean, Bob didn't mention this, but he's a farm guy. He grew up on a farm in upstate New York. I myself personally, my dad was a horse trainer and so was my uncle. So I kind of grew up in that realm. And before I became interested in the equine nutrition, I was actually an end user, rode and competed on a bunch of different levels, not only in New England, but down here in Massachusetts. I mean, up there in Massachusetts and down here in Pennsylvania. But I, you know, have had the opportunity to work with some very good thoroughbred racehorse trainers, managed breeding farms, have bred horses myself. My wife still has her horse business. But what I realized as I got further along, that's 35 years we're talking about there, but as I got further along in my life growth, I decided that I wanted to focus on the health of the animals, because what you get out of the animals is essentially what you put into them. And I knew intrinsically on a bunch of different levels that something was missing there. And as I got an opportunity to travel with Bob and talk to him and talk to some of the people that he knows about nutrition, I realized that there's just a tip of the iceberg out there.
Yeah.
And it's my mission and my purpose to kind of do what's right for the horses. And we won't necessarily sell feed based on the fact that we need to make a number or something like that. It's all what's good for the horse. And, you know, as somebody who lives in this space, both of us, and really enjoy horses, it's important to us that we do the right thing that way.
Well, I find it very rewarding when we work with a barn or someone's horses to see the progress over 2, 3, or 6 months in achieving whatever that horse owner wants to achieve with that animal as it relates nutritionally.
Same here.
Yeah.
Very much so. We take pride in what we do, just like people take pride with their horses. And you know, there's certainly a link there between the relationship you have with animals and the way you look at the world. And that's kind of what we do.
Yeah. Cool. Very cool. Well, I can certainly, you know, kind of testify personally to your guys' expertise in this area, because as some of you may know, I think I mentioned this on the blog before, but I started working with Robert and Bob in, was it this spring or was it last winter?
I think it's this spring.
In the spring,
yeah. So not quite a year, but I called them in just because I was getting feed from a commercial mill, and I just wasn't, you know, I had some horses that weren't putting on weight like they should. I had other horses that, you know, where I was really struggling to manage their weight, and, you know, I knew they were laryngitis prone, so I was worried about that. So anyway, that's why I had these guys in, and, you know, they ended up helping me with a new feeding program that I'm feeding less actual concentrate, but, you know, as a barn manager, it's actually less cost to me, and the horses look a lot better. You know, we've actually been, you know, objectively tracking their progress through body condition scores and stuff, and there's, you know, there's some real progress. So I can definitely thank you guys for your service there.
Our pleasure.
So
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, I was going to wrap it up there, but I looked at my notebook, and there was one more question that I just have to ask, because I think it's such a big one. Does grain make horses hot?
Well, you know what? Most of my life, I've been taught that, but in the recent years, we've actually started doing more nutritional research on horses, which is a whole nother subject to talk about. But we finally learned that feeding grain, protein does not make horses hot. Feeding carbohydrates make horses hot, similar to a sugar rush in a young child.
Okay.
We always thought it was protein. We now know it's carbohydrate, starch, and sugar.
Yep.
So corn, oats, and barley
Okay.
are what will make a horse hot, not the protein.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the starches in those materials that will break down into sugars, and I use the term Halloween candy syndrome. That'll actually give them a glucose spike in their blood, and that'll make them feel somewhat giddy. And it's not an accident that most racehorses subsist. They get fed mainly in totally oat diet. Again, oats are they're a great calorie source. There's nothing wrong with them, but like anything, as we said in the beginning of our discussion, anything in excess can certainly create problems. And in behavioral problems like that, if you're looking for an energy source and your horse is excitable, you want to stay away from the starch carbohydrate source. You want to start looking at an energy source like a higher fat product or a fiber-based product.
Calorie.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I think with that one, we will wrap it up. Thank you guys again for doing this. And if you guys, if we either didn't get to your question or if you didn't get a chance to ask a question, go ahead and put any questions that you have in the comments below this video, and I will forward them to these fine guys, and I'm sure you guys will be happy to answer them.
It'd be our pleasure.
All right, cool. Well, put your questions or your comments down below, and thank you guys again for doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us. I've enjoyed it.
All right.
All the best.
Very
Bye
good.
now. Yep.